You know that feeling when everyone around you seems to have it all figured out and you're just existing? That was me 5 years ago. While my friends were posting their house keys on Instagram with captions like "officially a homeowner" and "living the American dream," I was sitting in my one-bedroom rental apartment, eating ramen noodles and wondering if I'd ever amount to anything. They called me the eternal renter, the guy who'd never own anything real, never build equity, never truly succeed. Well, if you're watching this right now, you're about to hear how those same people who mocked me are now begging to rent from me. And honestly, if my story resonates with you, if you've ever felt like you're behind in life, hit that subscribe button because I'm Sarah, and I share real stories about real people who turned their lives around in ways nobody saw coming. I need to take you back to where this all started, because the beginning of my story isn't pretty. It's not Instagram-worthy or something you'd brag about at a high school reunion. I was 28 years old, working as a customer service representative at a call center, making $32,000 a year in Austin, Texas. Not exactly the kind of salary that screams, future real estate mogul, right? I was living in a cramped apartment complex called Sunset Gardens, which sounds way nicer than it actually was. The walls were thin, the neighbors were loud, and the parking lot always smelled like cigarettes and disappointment. But here's what really got to me. What kept me up at night, staring at the ceiling with its suspicious water stains. It wasn't just the apartment or the job. It was the constant reminder from everyone around me that I was falling behind. My college friends had started buying houses, getting married, having kids. They'd post photos of their new granite countertops and their 2-car garages, and I'd scroll through Facebook feeling like I was watching everyone else's life happen while mine stood still. The worst part was the family gatherings. Oh God, the family gatherings. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every birthday party became this informal competition where everyone would update each other on their latest achievements. My cousin Derek, who was 2 years younger than me, had just bought his second house. My sister Jessica was renovating her kitchen. My brother-in-law Mike was talking about investment properties. And then there was me, still renting, still struggling to save money, still feeling like I was playing catch-up in a game where everyone else had a head start. I remember one particular evening that changed everything. It was Jessica's birthday party, and she was showing off her new house to everyone. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a backyard with a deck that Mike had built himself. Everyone was gathered around the kitchen island, drinking wine and talking about mortgage rates and property taxes like they were discussing the weather. I was standing there with my beer, trying to look engaged, but inside I felt like a fraud. That's when Derek, who'd had a few too many drinks, decided to share his wisdom with the group. "You know what separates successful people from unsuccessful people?" he said, looking directly at me. "Successful people take risks. They invest in their future. They don't waste money on rent." The entire room went quiet. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, waiting for my response. But what could I say? He wasn't wrong about the rent part. I was paying $1,200 a month for an apartment I'd never own, money that was essentially disappearing into someone else's pocket. But Derek wasn't done. "I mean, look at my portfolio," he continued, pulling out his phone to show photos of his properties. "I've got 2 rental properties now, and they're both cash flowing positive. Meanwhile, some people are still throwing money away on rent." He didn't say my name, but he didn't have to. Everyone knew he was talking about me. Jessica tried to change the subject, but the damage was done. I finished my beer, made some excuse about having to work early, and left the party feeling smaller than I'd ever felt in my life. The drive home was brutal. I kept replaying Derek's words in my head, along with the looks on everyone's faces. They weren't mean-spirited people, my family. They genuinely wanted me to succeed. But their pity was almost worse than outright cruelty. I could see it in their eyes, the way they looked at me like I was this project they needed to fix, this cautionary tale about what happens when you don't have your life together by 30. When I got back to my apartment that night, I sat on my second-hand couch and really looked around at my life. The furniture was mismatched, half of it from thrift stores and half from my college days. The walls were bare because I wasn't allowed to paint them. The kitchen was tiny, barely big enough for one person to cook in. This wasn't a home. It was just a place where I slept and ate and waited for my real life to begin. But here's the thing about rock bottom, something I didn't understand at the time. Sometimes you have to hit it before you can push off from it. That night, sitting in my rental apartment, feeling sorry for myself, I made a decision. I decided that I was going to prove Derek wrong. I was going to prove all of them wrong. I just didn't know how yet. The next morning, I called in sick to work. I know that sounds irresponsible, but I needed time to think, to plan, to figure out how someone with my income and my credit score could possibly get into real estate. I spent the entire day researching, reading articles, watching YouTube videos, trying to understand how people with limited resources could break into property investment. That's when I discovered something that changed my entire perspective. I found out about a concept called house hacking, where you buy a small multifamily property, live in one unit, and rent out the others. The rental income from the other units helps cover your mortgage, sometimes even making the property cash flow positive. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a way to get started with minimal money down. But even with this strategy, I had a major problem. I didn't have enough saved for a down payment. I was living paycheck to paycheck, and after rent, utilities, food, and basic expenses, I was lucky if I had $50 left over each month. How was I supposed to save $10,000 or $20,000 for a down payment when I could barely save $50? That's when I made what everyone thought was the craziest decision of my life. I decided to move back in with my parents. I was 28 years old, and I was going to move back into my childhood bedroom. The shame was overwhelming. I could already imagine the conversations at family gatherings. Did you hear about Sarah? She had to move back in with her parents. But I pushed through the embarrassment because I knew it was the only way to save enough money quickly. My parents were actually really supportive, which surprised me. When I explained my plan to them, my dad nodded approvingly. "That's smart thinking," he said. "Sometimes you have to take a step back to take 2 steps forward." My mom was worried about me, but she could see how determined I was. They agreed to let me move back in for 18 months, and I promised to pay them $500 a month for room and board. Moving back home at 28 was one of the most humbling experiences of my life. I had to pack up my entire adult life and squeeze it into my teenage bedroom. I had to follow house rules again, like not making noise after 10 p.m. and cleaning up after myself in the kitchen. I had to explain to dates why I was living with my parents, which was about as attractive as it sounds. But here's what nobody understood at the time, including me. Those 18 months living at home were like a masterclass in delayed gratification. Every month, instead of paying $1,200 in rent, I was paying $500 in room and board. That extra $700 went straight into my savings account. Plus, I was eating home-cooked meals instead of takeout, which saved me another couple $100 a month. I also took on a second job. After my regular shift at the call center, I started delivering food for DoorDash 3 nights a week and on weekends. It was exhausting, driving around Austin until midnight, but every dollar I earned was getting me closer to my goal. I tracked every expense, every dollar saved, every step closer to having enough for a down payment. The hardest part wasn't the work or the saving, it was the social isolation. My friends stopped inviting me out because I always said no to expensive dinners and nights at bars. They didn't understand that I was working towards something bigger. From their perspective, I was just being cheap and antisocial. Some of them actually stopped calling altogether. I remember one friend, Amanda, telling me I was obsessed with money and that I was missing out on life. She wasn't wrong about the obsession part, but she was wrong about missing out on life. I was preparing for a completely different kind of life. Month by month, my savings account grew. $500, then $1,000, then $2,000. It felt like progress, but it was slow progress. Sometimes I'd lie awake at night, wondering if I was making a huge mistake. What if I saved all this money and couldn't find a good deal? What if I wasn't cut out for real estate investing? What if Derek was right and I was just a perpetual renter who was deluding himself? But I kept going. I kept studying the market, learning about different neighborhoods, understanding what made properties good investments. I started driving around Austin on weekends, looking at properties, getting a feel for different areas. I learned about cap rates and cash-on-cash returns. I studied financing options and began understanding the difference between conventional loans and FHA loans. After 8 months of saving, I had $12,000 in my account. It wasn't enough for a traditional down payment on most properties, but I'd learned about FHA loans that only required 3.5% down. I started looking more seriously at small multifamily properties, particularly duplexes and triplexes in up-and-coming neighborhoods. That's when I found it. The property that would change everything. It was a rundown duplex in East Austin, in a neighborhood that was just starting to show signs of gentrification. The listing price was $220,000, which meant I'd need about $8,000 for the down payment plus closing costs. The property needed work, which is why it was priced below market value, but the bones were solid. Both units were currently rented, but the tenants were paying below market rent. One unit was renting for $800 a month and the other for $750. I ran the numbers over and over again. If I could increase the rents to market rate after renovating, I could potentially get $1,100 for each unit. That would be $2,200 in monthly rental income, which would more than cover the mortgage, taxes, and insurance. I submitted an offer for $200,000, and to my amazement, it was accepted. The seller was motivated because he was moving out of state and wanted to close quickly. I was terrified and excited at the same time. This was really happening. I was about to become a property owner. The inspection revealed some issues, as expected. The roof needed repair, the plumbing was old, and both units needed cosmetic updates. But nothing was deal-breaking. I negotiated with the seller to cover some of the major repairs, and we agreed on a final price of $195,000. Closing day was surreal. I remember sitting in the title company office, signing document after document, thinking about how I'd gone from Derek's mocking comment to this moment in just 10 months. When the closing agent handed me the keys, I actually got emotional. I was holding the keys to my first property, my first real investment in my future. But owning the property was just the beginning. Now I had to make it profitable. I moved into the smaller unit, which needed less work, and focused on renovating the larger unit first. I spent every weekend and evening working on that property. I learned how to install flooring, paint walls, fix plumbing, and replace light fixtures. YouTube became my best friend. I watched countless tutorials on home improvement, teaching myself skills I never thought I'd need. The work was exhausting, but it was also incredibly satisfying. Every improvement I made was adding value to my property and increasing my potential rental income. After 2 months of renovation, the larger unit was transformed. I listed it for rent at $1,100 a month, and it was rented within a week. The smaller unit, where I was living, still needed work, but it was livable. I was essentially living for free because the rent from the larger unit covered most of my mortgage payment. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't throwing money away on rent. I was building equity, and my property was generating income. 6 months after buying the duplex, I was ready to tackle the unit I was living in. I moved in with my parents temporarily again while I renovated my unit. Another month of work, and I was able to rent it out for $1,100 as well. Now I had $2,200 in monthly rental income, and my mortgage payment was only $1,600. I was cash flowing $600 a month, and I was building equity in a property that was already appreciating in value. But the real validation came at Christmas dinner that year. I was living in a small apartment again, having moved out of my parents' house for the second time, but now I had a very different story to tell. When Derek asked about my living situation, I casually mentioned that I owned a duplex in East Austin that was generating positive cash flow. The conversation stopped. Everyone looked at me like I'd just announced I was moving to Mars. "You own rental property?" Jessica asked. "Since when?" I explained the whole story, how I'd moved back home to save money, how I'd found and renovated the duplex, how I was now generating passive income from real estate. Derek was quiet for the first time I could remember. When he finally spoke, he said, "That's actually really smart. I didn't know you were into real estate." The condescension was gone from his voice. For the first time, he was talking to me like an equal. But I wasn't done, not even close. The success with the duplex had given me confidence and, more importantly, credibility with lenders. I started looking for my next property immediately. I used the cash flow from the duplex to save for another down payment, and I leveraged the equity I'd built to qualify for a larger loan. 8 months later, I found a fourplex in the same neighborhood. It was in worse condition than the duplex, but the potential was enormous. The asking price was $350,000, but again, it needed significant work. I offered $320,000 and it was accepted. This time, I had a system. I'd learned from the duplex renovation, and I knew which contractors to use and which work I could do myself. I also had rental income from the duplex, helping to cover the mortgage on the fourplex while I renovated it. The fourplex renovation took 4 months, but when it was done, I had 4 units renting for an average of $1,200 each. That's $4,800 in monthly rental income from one property. After the mortgage, taxes, and insurance, I was netting about $1,800 a month from the fourplex alone. Now I had 2 properties generating a combined monthly cash flow of about $2,400. That was almost as much as my salary from the call center. I was starting to see a path to financial independence that I'd never imagined possible. But the neighborhood was changing too. East Austin was becoming hot. Coffee shops were opening, restaurants were moving in, and young professionals were starting to buy homes in the area. Property values were climbing, and I was sitting on 2 properties that were appreciating rapidly. That's when I made my biggest decision yet. I quit my job at the call center. I know it sounds crazy, giving up a steady paycheck to become a full-time real estate investor, but the numbers made sense. My properties were generating more income than my job, and I needed more time to find and manage additional properties. With more time to focus on real estate, I started looking at larger deals. I found a small apartment complex, 8 units, that was being sold by an owner who was tired of being a landlord. The property was underperforming because half the units were vacant and the occupied units were renting below market rate. I offered to buy the property with owner financing, which meant the seller would act as the bank and I'd pay him monthly instead of getting a traditional mortgage. He agreed because he wanted steady income without the hassle of management. I took over the property with minimal money down and immediately began renovating the vacant units. Within 6 months, I had all 8 units rented at market rates. The property was generating over $9,000 a month in rental income. After paying the owner financing, property management, and expenses, I was netting about $4,000 a month from this property alone. 3 years after buying my first duplex, I owned 11 rental units across 3 properties. My monthly cash flow was over $7,000, and my properties had appreciated by more than $300,000 in total. I had gone from a struggling renter to a successful real estate investor in less than 4 years. But the real transformation wasn't just financial. I had learned skills I never thought I'd need. I could negotiate deals, manage contractors, analyze properties, and handle tenant relations. I had developed confidence and business acumen that extended far beyond real estate. The neighborhood where I'd bought my first 2 properties had completely transformed. East Austin was now one of the hottest areas in the city. Property values had doubled, and the area was featured in magazines as one of the best up-and-coming neighborhoods in America. I was sitting on over $1 million in real estate assets, and I was just getting started. That's when the phone calls started coming. The same people who had mocked me for renting were now asking for advice. Derek called me one day, completely different from the condescending cousin I remembered. "I've been thinking about getting into real estate," he said. "Do you have any advice?" The irony wasn't lost on me. Jessica wanted to know if I had any properties for sale. Amanda, the friend who had accused me of being obsessed with money, asked if I could help her find a rental property to invest in. Even my old co-workers from the call center were reaching out, wanting to know how I'd made the transition from customer service to real estate. But the most satisfying call came from someone I'd never expected. It was from a property management company representing several of my former neighbors from Sunset Gardens, the apartment complex where I'd lived during my lowest point. They wanted to know if I'd be interested in buying the entire complex. The irony was perfect. The place where I'd felt like such a failure, where I'd lived paycheck to paycheck, was now being offered to me as an investment opportunity. The owner was retiring and wanted to sell. I toured the property with the management company, looking at the same units where I'd once lived, the same parking lot where I'd sat in my car after Derek's birthday party, feeling like a complete failure. I made an offer on the complex. It was a large purchase, requiring significant financing, but I now had the assets and income to qualify for commercial real estate loans. The deal closed 4 months later. I was now the owner of Sunset Gardens, the place where my journey had really begun. The first thing I did was renovate the units. I improved the landscaping, repaved the parking lot, and updated the amenities. I wanted to create the kind of place where I would have been proud to live. The property that had once symbolized my failures became a symbol of my success. But owning my old apartment complex was just the beginning. Word had spread in the local real estate community about my success. Other investors wanted to partner with me. Lenders were eager to work with me. I was no longer the guy who couldn't afford to buy a house. I was a respected real estate investor with a proven track record. I started a property management company to handle my growing portfolio. I hired employees, including some of my former coworkers from the call center who wanted to transition into real estate. I was creating jobs and opportunities for others, something I'd never imagined possible during my days of eating ramen and counting pennies. 5 years after that humiliating birthday party, I owned 43 rental units across Austin. My properties were generating over $30,000 in monthly rental income. I had gone from someone who couldn't afford to buy a house to someone who owned an entire block of properties in one of Austin's most desirable neighborhoods. The financial success was incredible, but the personal transformation was even more meaningful. I had learned that success isn't about where you start. It's about your willingness to endure short-term discomfort for long-term gain. I had learned that other people's opinions of your current situation don't define your future potential. Most importantly, I had learned that sometimes the people who mock you today might be the ones asking for your help tomorrow. The block that everyone now wants to live on, the one that's featured in Austin real estate magazines and tour guides, is the same block where I bought my first duplex 5 years ago. The property values have tripled, and there's a waiting list for rental units. The coffee shop on the corner has a line every morning, and the restaurants are packed every night. Derek finally bought his first rental property last year. He asked me to help him find it, and I did. We actually work together now on some deals. He's never mentioned that birthday party, but I think about it sometimes. I think about how his words, meant to hurt, actually became the motivation that changed my life completely. Jessica invested in 2 rental properties with my help. She's doing well, and she often tells people that her sister taught her everything she knows about real estate. Amanda left her corporate job to work for my property management company. She's happy, and she's building her own real estate portfolio with the skills she's learned. My parents are incredibly proud, but they're also amazed. They tell people that I figured out something they never understood about money and investing. They still live in the same house where I moved back at 28, but now they joke that their daughter is their landlord's landlord. But the most rewarding part of this journey isn't the money or the properties or the validation from people who once doubted me. It's the confidence that comes from knowing I can handle whatever challenges come my way. When you've lived through the embarrassment of moving back home at 28, when you've worked 16-hour days renovating properties, when you've learned to see opportunity where others see problems, you develop an unshakable belief in your ability to create the life you want. I still live simply, though I could afford much more. I drive a reliable car, live in a modest apartment, and invest most of my income back into real estate. I've learned that building wealth isn't about showing off. It's about creating options and security for your future. The real estate market has continued to evolve, and I've evolved with it. I've branched out into commercial properties, fix and flips, and even some out-of-state investments. I've built a business that generates passive income and continues to grow even when I'm not actively working. But I never forget where I started. Sometimes I drive by that original duplex, the one that started everything. It's worth over $400,000 now, and it's still generating rental income. The tenant who lives there now is a young professional, probably around the same age I was when I bought the building. I wonder if he has dreams and goals that seem impossible from where he's sitting. I hope he does. The truth is, everyone's journey is different. Not everyone needs to become a real estate investor to find success and fulfillment, but everyone needs to believe that their current situation doesn't define their future potential. Everyone needs to understand that the people who mock your dreams today might be the ones asking for your help tomorrow. If you're watching this and feeling stuck, if you're tired of other people's opinions defining your worth, if you're ready to take control of your financial future, then I want you to know that it's possible. It won't be easy, and it won't happen overnight, but it's possible. The block they all want to live on started with one duplex and a young woman who was tired of being underestimated. It started with someone who was willing to move back home, work 2 jobs, and spend every weekend learning new skills. It started with someone who decided that other people's definitions of success weren't going to define her life. I want to hear from you. Have you ever been underestimated? Have you ever used someone else's doubt as motivation to prove them wrong? What dreams are you working toward that might seem impossible to others right now? Share your story in the comments below, because I read every single one, and your journey might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. The best revenge isn't getting back at the people who doubted you. The best revenge is building a life so incredible that their opinions become irrelevant. The best revenge is becoming the person you always knew you could be, despite what anyone else thought was possible. They mocked me for renting, but now I own the block they all want to live on. And honestly, I'm just getting started.